Cinderella was released in 1950 by Walt Disney Animation and is their 12th animated film and the start of what would become known as the Silver Age of Disney animation. The film is based on the Charles Perrault fairy tale of the same name, and when Cinderella's cruel stepmother prevents her from attending the royal ball, she gets some unexpected help from the lovable mice Gus and Jock and from her fairy godmother. I've been excited to finally talk about Cinderella in this huge Disney retrospective I'm trying to do, and some of that comes from me really loving the movie overall, but it also serves as a return to form for Disney animation as we move on from the wartime package film era and move into one of the most iconic eras of Disney animation, the Silver Age. I'm also excited to talk about this movie because of the recent 4K release, and after watching this version of the film, the movie's never looked better. It still holds up as a crowning achievement in animation, and it still stands as one of the best Disney princess films ever made. But before we go into my thoughts on the movie, let's do what we always do here and go behind the scenes to see just how this film was made. Cinderella first started out as a short that Disney worked on for the Laugh-O-Gram studio in 1922, and by December of 1933, he became interested in producing a second version as one of his silly symphonies with Burt Gillett attached to direct and Frank Churchill as composer. However, by 1938, the film had become too complicated to be condensed into a single short, and it was suggested that it become a feature-length film with a 14-page outline being written, and 2 years later, another treatment was written, which had some similarities to the finished product, but this version stuck closer to the original story. By September of 1943, though, Disney assigned Dick Huemer and Joe Grant to begin work as story supervisors with a budget of $1 million. However, by 1945, the story was halted. During the writing phase, Cinderella was written to be a less passive character than Snow White ended up being, and more rebellious overall. It was in spring of 1946 that Disney held 3 story meetings, and a treatment was created that involved the prince being introduced earlier into the story and a cat and mouse conflict. Eventually, after the release of Fun and Fancy Free in 1947, Walt Disney Productions' bank debt declined from $4.2 million to $3 and wanted to desperately restore the studio to full financial health by producing a full-length animated film. By this time, 3 films were in the works: Cinderella, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. Cinderella was ahead of all the other projects by early 1948, and by that time, the cat and mouse sequences greatly expanded, and afterwards, it was obvious that Cinderella was going to be their next major picture from the studio. Much like with previous feature-length Disney films, live-action actors on a soundstage were used as reference for the animation, with actors like Helen Stanley being brought in to perform the live-action reference for Cinderella, and she would later do the same for Sleeping Beauty and 101 Dalmatians. By 1950, the animation board, which had been established in 1940, was made up of 9 supervising animators known as the 9 Old Men, and they worked on the designs of the characters for the film. The music and lyrics would be done by Oliver Wallace and Paul Smith, and this film would actually launch the Walt Disney Music Company as a whole. The film would go on to be released in theaters on February 15th, 1950, and on a budget of $2.2 million, secured Disney a box office gross of $182 million. The movie would be re-released in subsequent years like 1957, 1965, 73, 81, and 87. Upon its release, the film became a critical success, garnering it the best reception for a Disney film since Dumbo, with many stating the film harkened back to the style of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and that the movie would please both children and adults alike, but the characterization of Cinderella left some critics mixed and found her banal when trying to act more like a human being. Throughout the years, thoughts on the film have only continued to remain positive, and it is considered a timeless classic among the Disney canon, and the film would go on to be nominated at the Academy Awards for Best Score, Original Song, and Sound Recording. The movie's cultural impact cannot be overstated either, with Cinderella still being one of the most popular Disney princesses, and Cinderella's castle being the center point of Walt Disney World in Orlando. Nonetheless, Cinderella put Disney back on top once again and ushered in a new era for the studio that has turned the Silver Age into one of Disney's most iconic eras. Now, with all of that out of the way, let's go into my thoughts on the film. Right off the bat, I want to say that Cinderella is an absolute classic and is still perhaps the best film to come out of the Silver Age. This movie brought Disney back in a big way after 7 years of releasing only packaged films. This was their return to feature-length storytelling, and what a film to start out on by respecting their roots and returning to tell yet another fairy tale like Snow White before it. I've always been a big fan of Cinderella ever since I first watched it, and now with the recent 4K release of the film, this movie has never looked better and is the best possible way to experience this film. I always thought this movie was very beautiful, but in some ways, I think what they were able to accomplish with Snow White is still even more impressive. But watching this movie in 4K really improved my experience watching this film, and I found the animation to be even more impressive than I originally thought when watching previous versions. And I think Cinderella should be in conversation as one of the best animated films by Disney. Before we get into my thoughts, though, I kind of want to talk a little bit about my thoughts on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, because my thoughts on that film tie heavily into what I think about this film overall. If you've watched my previous review on Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and if you haven't yet, I suggest you do that. But if you recall my thoughts on that film, you'll know that while I think the movie is an important film and a classic in its own right, I feel like it's not the best that Disney had to offer, but served as a major stepping stone for what they could accomplish in the future. Snow White, in a lot of ways, felt like a trial run on how to take the short narrative format of a silly symphony and turn it into a feature-length film. And Snow White was able to accomplish that by making the narrative feel like a series of short gags put together to make a film. But every scene could have stood out on its own as its own individual short and gag. And there was very little connective tissue, making the film feel like a complete story. I also wasn't the biggest fan of the dwarves or even Snow White herself, who ends up being a very passive character that's hard to connect to. Thankfully, many of the problems I had in Snow White are rectified in Cinderella. I think this makes Cinderella the far superior film in the long run. The narrative feels more complete and is structured like a traditional film. It has its moments with its gags, and the dwarves of Snow White have been replaced by the mice of Cinderella. But this time, these gags don't feel like separate instances, but instead feel tied directly into the story. But the biggest part for me that makes Cinderella the superior film over Snow White is the title character herself. Cinderella, right from the start, is such a likable character and has far more character overall than Snow White had. She's very proactive from the start and feels like the prototype for Ariel and Belle many years later. Watching the film this time, I was shocked by how much time they spend establishing her character, her wants and dreams, and showcasing the best parts of her personality, so you can get to know her before the narrative fully kicks off. Eileen Woods does such a phenomenal job as the voice of Cinderella and brings a real spirit to the character that makes her both wise beyond her years and instantly likable. I think the film also does a really good job with characters in general, especially its villains, Lady Tremaine and her daughters, Anastasia and Drizella. Eleanor Audley is deliciously evil as Lady Tremaine, and her entrance into the film is nothing short of iconic, where you see her just sitting in bed, stroking her cat, cleverly named Lucifer. She just oozes evil and is a great villain in this film who is nothing but cruel to Cinderella and lives for only making her life a nightmare filled with chores as her and her daughters try to climb the social ladder. I'm always heartbroken in the scene where Cinderella has made her dress for the ball only to have it ruined by her stepsisters, and Lady Tremaine does nothing but smile in satisfaction. She's a great villain. But we also have the hilarious relationship between the king and the Grand Duke, who I was surprised to find out were both voiced by the same person, Louis Van Rooten. Their banter is some of my favorite bits of comedy in the film, as the king is desperate to find the prince a bride, simply so the king can finally have grandchildren. And I love how the king and the Grand Duke act like this strange married couple that bicker with each other. They're just such fun characters and really bring a lot of good humor to the film. As for the mice in this movie, I mentioned that they're more or less the seven dwarfs of this film, and I find them far superior. The gags with them aren't just there for comedy's sake, but to inform the story as they try to find items for Cinderella's dress, or try to retrieve a key to get her out of her tower, or a few run-ins with the cat Lucifer. Their moments are fun, and focusing on mainly Jacques and Gus is a big plus, rather than giving it to several mice similar to what they did with the dwarves in Snow White. They're just better replacements overall, although they still make up a big portion of the film's runtime compared to Cinderella herself, but I think their scenes are much more entertaining as a whole. I think the film shines brightest, though, in its dramatic moments. As mentioned, when talking about Lady Tremaine, there is nothing more heartbreaking in this film than to see Cinderella go through all this work to make a dress for the ball, and then to see that same dress destroyed by her stepmother and stepsisters. It's a very chaotic and almost violent scene that is absolutely heartbreaking and is the true lowest low for our character. And seeing her on the bench crying with her dress completely destroyed, you just completely feel for this character, because they've done such a good job getting you to care for her and showing her daily routine, that to see her dreams crushed in one fell swoop is very effective. But all of that is subsided with the emergence of the fairy godmother, who sets Cinderella on her way and provides her with a new dress and carriage to send her on her way. What follows next is all of Cinderella's dreams coming true in a single night, and she joins high society and dances with the prince in an extremely romantic scene that's heightened by the music to great effect. The climax of this film is really great too, and combines a great ticking clock as the Grand Duke visits to have Lady Tremaine's daughters try on the glass slipper, and poor Cinderella is locked in her tower. We move from Cinderella desperately trying to get out of her tower to the mice fighting Lucifer and trying to get the key to unlock the door, all while Anastasia and Drusilla are trying to put on the glass slipper. And it all comes to a head when Cinderella comes down and the glass slipper is shattered by Lady Tremaine. But much to her disbelief, Cinderella happens to have the other slipper. Lady Tremaine's expression in this moment of realization is absolute gold, by the way, and I love it. Cinderella is just a very well-told fairy tale, from the opening of the book that starts the film to the beautiful storybook art that begins the story with the narration. It does such a good job of establishing characters and making them very memorable. And before I continue with my final thoughts, I have to bring up the music and the animation again. The music is so good. From the score itself, which is wonderfully romantic and sweeping in all the best ways, to a soundtrack with many memorable pieces, and the always catchy Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo. This is a soundtrack that has stood the test of time despite having some age on it now, and is just an iconic Disney soundtrack. The animation is also lush and gorgeous, especially with the 4K. The colors just pop, and the hues are much darker and richer than ever before. It's now the ideal way to watch this movie and makes an old movie new again in a really big way. Cinderella truly is a classic with great characters and well-told story with memorable music and gorgeous animation. It serves as a shining example of the power of animation and the capabilities of the team at Disney for excellent storytelling for all ages. However, I still think the film can lose itself in its gags, especially with the mice who really do make up a huge portion of the movie. But their scenes are really entertaining. Everything is here to make for a classic Disney princess film that I think would be improved upon years later through the likes of The Little Mermaid or Beauty and the Beast. But as it stands, Cinderella is still an achievement and has every right to be held up as one of the greatest animated films of all time, even though when I look back at all the Disney films I've ever seen, there's just a few more that I think are even better than this. And with all that said, I'm going to give Cinderella an 8 out of 10. I love this movie, and the more I watch it, I love it even more. But I don't think it ever hits some of the highs of some of my personal favorite Disney movies. But it's still a great film nonetheless that should be celebrated. But anyway, that's all I've got for you. So as always, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and stay positive.